It's 77 years that Palestine has been occupied. And there's been, there's always this conversation that keeps taking place, and you see it more and more in mainstream media and on talk shows. For a lot of people in the West, they woke up on the 7th of October, and a lot of people who know history and who understand the reality of the situation keep referring viewers and listeners and audiences to it didn't begin on the 7th of October, but we need to go back all the way back to 1948 and even before that in order to understand what's taken place in Palestine. What in your view was the kind of the political situation and the governance situation in Palestine? Because there were obviously events that led up to the Nakba in 1948. What was taking place on the ground and around the region?
Absolutely. Let's just look very quickly here at how Israel wants us to perceive history, how the Zionist narrative is constructed, and how the Palestinian narrative is constructed. Because if we try to understand these 2 points, we will be able to understand so much about the history that led to all of these events, starting with the Nakba all the way to the current genocide in Gaza and a different process of genocide and ethnic cleansing in the West Bank. Israel wants, or Israeli historians and academia, they wants us to believe that everything that has happened in history was an immediate reaction to something that the Palestinians or the Arabs or whomever have kind of imposed on Israel. So everything that Israel has done, for example, the Nakba, it was a reaction. It was a reaction to the claim that Arab armies came, thundering down every direction to destroy this tiny little state that was just established and to kill, to carry out another Holocaust, while the first one hasn't fully concluded. On the other hand, the Palestinians, like any astute student of history, wants us to understand that there is always context to every event. The genocide in Gaza did not happen in a vacuum, and it's okay to talk about what that context is, because if you don't understand the context, you will never truly appreciate the events that shape history. So we have to look at Palestine at the eve of the Nakba. When we talk about the Nakba, quite often we are referring to specific events that happened in 1948. The actual Nakba, or the catastrophe as is known within Palestinian lexicon, is an event that actually started late 1947, not 1948. And why is that important? Because in 1947, no Arab armies, no outside forces were involved in trying to reverse the ethnic cleansing that the Zionist militias, later the State of Israel, the Israeli army, um, was conducting in various parts of Palestine. In other words, the Arabs were reacting to something that was already taking place starting in 1947, as opposed to Israel reacting to something that the Arabs have supposedly done. But let's go a little bit further than that. The Palestine, starting in the 1920s, was under British mandate. What is the British mandate? The League of Nations, which preceded the United Nations, was essentially a club of powerful countries, mostly Western countries, that kind of shaped global politics. So they have decided that Palestine, uh, like other polities in the Middle East and other parts of the world, mostly in the global South, were to be placed under Western mandates, Britain, France, and others. These Western governments were supposed to help the people of these nations achieve a degree of independence, because they don't have the political means or structures to fully move from an era of colonialism and slavery and exploitation into an era of civilization and independence and political sovereignty. So they needed to be helped. So naturally, who is the most rational actor that would help them achieve that is the very nations that actually colonized them and exploited them for hundreds of years. I mean, as idiotic as this may sound, that's what actually happened. But not just that. In the case of Palestine, the Palestinians are not actually guided by the British in order for them to achieve that coveted independence. The British were in Palestine helping the Zionists achieve their coveted independence at the expense of the Palestinian people. What was the legal structure for that British quest to help the Zionists achieve their independence in a land that doesn't belong to them? uh, was the Balfour Declaration. The Balfour Declaration, we have to step back just a little bit, 1917. It was a British declaration that promised a national home for the Jewish people in Palestine, laying the foundation for the political support for the Zionist project, completely disregarding the existing Palestinian population, who constituted about, and I'm thinking here from memory, for sure over 90% of the inhabitants, although I'm not certain about the exact number. The Balfour Declaration itself, and now we have to step back just a little bit to enlarge in the context. The Balfour Declaration itself was a response to the rise of the Zionist movement in Europe. The Zionist movement is not an indigenous Middle Eastern movement, it's a European movement, and itself was shaped around the European ideologies that yielded fascism and Nazism later on, but was also kind of situated within an extremely colonial and exploitative European understanding of the global south and the rest of the world. So it's a colonial European movement that was espoused within a Western geopolitics, and started about, around the late 19th, early 20th century. And that's where the growth of the Zionist movement happened, with the idea that they want to build a Jewish state in Palestine. It's very important caveat here to remember, is that Palestine wasn't the top of the list of where that Jewish state was going to be established. And why is this relevant? It is relevant because the Zionists of today, the Israelis, argue that, this whole thing was really facilitated to allow the return of the Jewish people to their original homeland. If that was the case, why was certain parts of Africa considered to be that Jewish state, particularly an area within more or less part of it in today's Kenya? Why was Patagonia considered to be part of that Jewish state? So between Uganda, Kenya, and between Argentina, it makes no sense that if this was really supposed to be this part of a larger destiny of the return of the Jewish people to their original homeland, why would you think of other places aside from Palestine? The early Zionists were atheists. In fact, atheism has kind of defined Zionist leadership for many years. There is a switch that is happening in Israel today. It has started about 19 in the late 1970s with the rise of the right wing into political power, Menachem Begin, and other kind of components of what they call Zionist revisionism, all the way to today's Itamar Ben Gvir and Smotrich. But for decades, Zionists were atheists. So we now understand not only there's a colonial project, an exploitative project, a Western project, but it actually chose Palestine and it created the narrative around Palestine for purely political reasons, to the point that early Jews or many Jewish communities in Europe actually rejected Zionism, and this embrace of Zionism that happened to various Jewish communities around the world did not really take place until after the war of 1967, which we are going to talk about it here, where Israel suddenly tripled in size, and it seemed like a sustainable project. It seemed like the Zionists knew what they were doing, and that's where many of the Jewish communities that were in doubt about the power of Zionists and their ability to sustain their ideological project began kind of evaporating in favor of a new rediscovery of Zionism. The British mandate policies in Palestine therefore actively facilitated the Zionist immigration, land purchases, often through absentee landlords. If you want to, we can expand on what that means exactly, and completely suppressing Palestinian national aspirations and the resistance movements. It doesn't mean that Palestinians didn't resist. To the contrary, Palestinians were forming. I mean, just think about it. 1936, Palestinians launched a general strike that lasted for 6 months, in which all Palestinian societies, from the urban centers, the elites, the so-called effendis, all the way to the so-called fallahin, the peasants of Palestine, everybody participated in it. There was no social media, no Instagram, no TikTok, nothing of that sort. Yet somehow they found a way to communicate, to create this powerful, collective, at the time, as of yet, non-violent resistance to tell the British that we are a Palestinian people with a very defined sense of peoplehood, and we do have political agency, and we are unified, and we are capable of fighting back. So Palestinian political consciousness was formulated very, very early on in the process, which means another way of kind of defying the Zionist propaganda that Palestine had no sense of Palestinianism, that there was no such thing, that Palestinians were nomads and they did not belong to that land and they had no roots, no culture, no civilization. Explain these events that happened about 100 years ago, when most, today's nation states around the world did not actually formulate yet a sense of belonging to a particular geographic era. And many of today's countries, even in Europe itself, were actually did not exist in the current form in which they exist today.
I think that's a very important point that needs to be emphasized, because there's often the claim that there was never a Palestinian state. But if you go back, we find minted coins from the early days in Palestine. We find travel documents, we find maps, we find old Bibles with Palestine in there. In fact, some of the early Israeli leaders, Golda Meir, I think, carried a Palestinian passport, as did Shimon Peres. So this notion that's often regurgitated to the public by Israeli spokespeople is actually a complete lie. And people need to understand, the viewers need to understand, there was a very flourishing population in Palestine. And even though statehood as we know today didn't exist then, because this was just after around the First World War and then the fall of the Ottoman Empire, then Muslim lands in the Middle East started being carved up into nation states. I wonder if you could reflect on. You said there was a Jewish population already in Palestine, and then we have this influx of European Jews coming in, where the population swells between 1922 and 1935 from 9% to about 27%. How were these European Jews received by the Jewish Palestinians?
Right. So I think there's I would like to just make a quick comment regarding what you said accurately regarding the presentation of a state. What is a state anyway? Um, and this is where the Israelis, because you have to understand that the Zionists don't have a consistent narrative. The Zionists kind of poke holes in other people's narratives in order for them to legitimize themselves. You could explain to us why Israel has the right to exist as a state. Fine, we can argue against that. And by the way, Israel was admitted to the United Nations on the understanding that it respects various UN resolutions, including the right of return for Palestinian refugees and others, and Israel hasn't done so. So, if we are going to be speaking very strictly here from a legal point of view, Israel has not satisfied the very conditions that made it a state recognized by the United Nations as such. But that's for another conversation. However, most of the modern nation states that exist today did not exist back then. Many countries that with current boundaries right now, they did not have these boundaries back then. So how do we recognize what was a state, let's say in the 1920s, and was what was not a state? What was a state in 1917 when Mr. Balfour made his statement promising the historic land of Palestine to someone else? The concept of state has changed itself. The modern nation state did not exist in its current form, and still, I mean, as in the 50s, 60s, 70s, and 80s, some nations became states registered or accepted as members of the United Nations. But what existed is a homeland. Was there a group of people seeing itself as Palestinians, living in a place called Palestine, prior to the existence of Israel? Yes, that's the whole point of why the mandate system was created in the first place. The mandate system was not called British mandate over Israel because Israel did not exist. It was a British mandate over, you guessed it, Palestine. So even according to the League of Nations and the system of mandates, they recognize that there is a Palestinian homeland there for a group of people who see themselves as Palestinians, the same way there was a group of people seeing themselves as Egyptians and they needed a homeland and so forth and so on, or needed a state. And the same thing applies to Lebanon, Syria, and all these other countries in today's Middle East. The Palestinian relationship with Palestine, goes back thousands of years. Nur Masal has book Palestine, a 4,000-year history, is a must-read, at least for the etymology of the word Palestine. Palestina prima, Palestina secundo, Philistia, which goes even prior to the Roman designation of this entity called Palestina prima, Palestina secunda, goes even prior to that. Some believe that the term Philista goes back to the Canaanites, and others would say the ancient Egyptians. Some say that because of the tribes that lived by the coastal region, that's my family, because we are coastal people, Gaza and all the way in the coastal Palestinian space. These are, they used to call them the sea people. We are talking about thousands of years of history. But skip that. Go to the Mamluk period. Go to the Islamic period, the 7th century and after that. You're going to find that Palestine has always had a very specific geographical boundaries under various Muslim empires. That kind of, so today's borders really more or less the River Jordan, the Mediterranean Sea, the Sinai, the Galilee, to be more or less the boundaries of these areas. This was honored all the way by the Ottomans until the British mandate. And this is why the Mamluks, for example, refer to Palestine as Junt Palestine, right? More or less the district of Palestine, the state of Palestine. The Ottomans had a similar designation, Sunjuk Palestine, and so forth and so on. So there was not only territorial entity, but it was administered according to constitutions, rules, and so forth and so on. How about the Palestinian sense of national identity? We'll go back to study the Ahmed Bashar al-Jazzar's rebellion and state in Akka and northern Palestine, and his resistance to the French attempt by Napoleon Bonaparte to actually invade Palestine. What made Ahmed Bashar al-Jazzar able to create an army that was centered in the city of Akka today? What was the sense that drove these people to defend what exactly if they did not have a defined and refined sense of national identity that's worth fighting and dying for? So this notion that there was no such thing as Palestine wasn't invented, repeated by by these individuals, extremely racist, dehumanizing notion. More importantly, it has no understanding of history at all. It uses this segmented view of biblical history that believes that there was a group of people who are the Hebrews that existed there at one point, as if the Hebrews are not Palestinians. And by the way, they are part of ancient Palestinian history. They are as much my ancestors as much as the Arabs are my ancestors as well. And then you have this jump of thousands of years ago when the Balfour Declaration took place. I mean, any serious historian cannot possibly and should not engage with this kind of nonsense and really try to understand the history of Palestine through independent prism. Forget about how Palestinians like to view Palestine or not. Just look at it from a professional academic viewpoint. You are going to find that there's a whole new reality of how Palestine actually became to be known as Palestine.
Before we move on, I just want to touch on briefly what was the reaction in the region, in and around Palestine, to the UN partition plan of 1947. How was this met by those surrounding Palestine, by governments in the region, or by populations in the region? How was this received?
Right. So we need to know what is the UN, the partition plan. The partition plan, 1947, was Resolution 181. It proposed the division of Palestine, where about 56% of the land, the fertile part of the Palestinian land, the coastal area and the northern area, the fertile area, was allocated to the Jewish population of Palestine. And the remainder is to be allocated to the Palestinian Arab population, the native population. What was the land distribution at the time? Jewish ownership of Palestine at the time was less than 7% of the land. And that's after spending decades and infinite amounts of money to seize as much land and to purchase as much land as possible from the Palestinians. But they couldn't. The Palestinians were not selling their land. And that's another myth. The Palestinians were not selling land. Who sold some land were the kind of what they call the absentee landlords. A law was passed by the British that in large segments kind of acquired land illegally, or prevented the owners of the land to return to their land, or most of the families that own these lands were not actually based in Palestine itself. They were in today's Lebanon and Syria and Turkey. But even despite of all of these efforts, and of course a lot of the land was seized illegally because of the taxes. I am a poor farmer, a peasant, and I have a small plot of land, and I cannot afford the taxes. So the British government would come and seize the land, and it becomes owned by the authority. And some of that land was transferred to the Zionists. Yet, despite all of this, they could only acquire about 6% or so from the land. The population, the Jewish population of the, okay, so we have the original Arab Jews. These are people who have been living there for a long time. They spoke Arabic, the accent of the region which they come from. They saw themselves as part of the social fabric of Palestinian society. And they saw themselves as the descendants of the original Hebrew, right? But then you have these colonialists, these Zionists, these Westerners coming from Eastern Europe, they're coming from other parts of the world, mostly from Europe, and coming there and as foreigners, as colonialists, with the same mindset and mentality and racist view that Western colonialists went to Africa and went to other parts of the world, right? Because of the support of the British migration, the British, or the support of the British of Jewish migration to Palestine, they managed to gather up around anywhere between fourth to the, become or constituted about anywhere between fourth to the third of the population of Palestine at the time. But the vast majority of them were foreigners, were colonialists, were settlers. And yet, despite of the obvious deficiencies in terms of number and land ownership and all of that, the UN partition came under US pressure and under British pressure, and others came and gave that minority in Palestine 56% of the best of lands, and the remainder went to the native Palestinians. So obviously the Palestinians rejected it, wouldn't you? Anyone would reject that. The Arabs rejected it. It is kind of putting some sort of a legal designation on the colonization of the vast majority of Palestine. That's what it was. It wasn't a solution. Another caveat that I think it's really important. Say that I come to South Africa as Ramzy. Ramzy is a billionaire. Okay, he's not a freelance writer. He's a billionaire, and he has a lot of money. And I started buying land in South Africa and registering the land under my name. And I have a certain amount of land in South Africa, and I started bringing my family, my friends, my neighbors, my social circle to live in South Africa. Do I have the right to declare a state in South Africa? What kind of a political system that would allow this to happen? So it's clearly the UN resolution 181 regarding the partition of Palestine itself is a continuation of the work of the Peel Commission in 1937 that also advised the division of Palestine. It's a continuation of the Balfour Declaration that saw the establishment of a Jewish state. It was part of the same Western conspiracy, Western colonial program that ultimately aimed at ethnically cleansing the Palestinians from their land, and they achieved in doing so, unfortunately and tragically, in by mid 1948, leading to what we know as the Nakba, or the Great Catastrophe.